right, everybody. So, welcome. And how's everybody been doing at CypherCon? It's bomb. Okay, fantastic. We used the B word already. Hopefully, this doesn't get demonetized, right? We're monetizing. We're monetizing. Um, so, when I was coming up for this particular talk and trying to think of a wonderful, cute, captivating title that everyone would go, I want to go see that. And only about 12 of you said, I want to go see that. I was thinking about basically about how vulnerabilities work. And we're talking about the CVSS scores themselves, right? And so, when we were talking about aged vulnerabilities, and someone was talking to me and saying, like, you know what? There's a lot of old vulnerabilities that are like medium, but you know what? They're actually getting hit even today, more than the criticals of today. And I was just like, that's interesting. And we were talking about, the age, the dwell time. And I said, the longer this sat, it didn't change. It's almost like styrofoam in a landfill. Once it's in there, it never changes, right? And the landfill being the NVD, which the NVD is even having trouble keeping up now with its own garbage to have to process. So not quite sure what's going on there. I've tried to figure out what the answers are for that. But the NVD is even having a very hard time processing new CVEs and vulnerabilities into its databases. But who am I? I'm OddJobb. I've been a hacker for 12 years. I'm the host of Glass of Zero J. I basically just talk about information security. I do talk about this topic a couple times. I've changed some of my views on vulnerability management over the years. And I will probably continue to do that. And actually, if you went to HD Moore's keynote just 10 minutes ago, then you probably have seen how the industry hasn't really changed what it does. And this is kind of a part of that talk. This talk is a part of that, actually, that we need to be changing our demands on the industry. And it'll honestly start at home. I'm also senior director of detect and response for a health company. So incident response, security operations, and also threat and vulnerability management report up to me. That threat piece is very interesting, and it's really starting to turn into threat exposure management, right? Is what it really comes down to. And so we're gonna get in more to that. I also brew mead. So if you ever want to know the secrets of making what comes out of the bees behind make you feel good and taste taste good and make you feel funny things, you can get with me and I'll tell you how to do it. It's actually it's one of the most ancient and one of the most easiest beverages to make is mead. We've been doing it for a long time. That doesn't need to change. You can keep doing that and it will still taste good and be awesome. So, and there's my socials. You'll see them at the end as well in case you want to follow me. So we're going to go through a bit of an agenda here. So this talk is not necessarily a CVSS is dumb, should never have been made. We need to stop. CVSS has its purpose, but we're going to talk about what CVSS is. We're going to talk about the problem with CVSS. And we're also going to talk about a new way to prioritize vulns. And actually, that was another part of the talk. The reason why I was late, I wanted to make sure I got to that keynote because maybe there were some updates I needed to make to this. And I actually took a couple notes, and you'll see them in here. But a new way to prioritize vulns. We've really shifted towards the prioritization and how effectively we can do that. And here's a way you can do it without fancy tools, although the fancy tools do exist. And I do not represent any vendor from either scanners or security companies or people who make the fancy tools to visualize all this. I don't do any of that, but you can do it without. But let's just face it, no one wants to build their own fucking bird feeder these days. So when we take a look at the history of CVSS, we really need to talk about the history of vulnerabilities, right? And so really, when you think about vulnerabilities, you can probably go back into the 80s and really find some of your first vulnerabilities. Heck, some of the first vulnerabilities, the oldest CVEs we have, is just simply having an easy to guess password on your system. 123 ABC, right? I love you, or God, sex, who's watched hackers, right? So all of those are pretty easy to guess passwords, and that is honestly one of the earliest vulnerabilities. Had nothing to do with a coding issue, had nothing to do with a software problem. It was literally about a defense weakness that you have in your environment, a security weakness, so a vulnerability. But that quickly changed, and we started, everything was software and becoming more software based. So as software was getting developed, issues with that software became more prevalent. And so we really shifted the focus off of these vulnerabilities over here, detecting them, and we really started just calling the software things vulnerabilities. The problem was, for the first, I don't know what, maybe 15 years of really working on software vulnerabilities, we didn't really have a common way to figure out how bad this really is. It was kind of up to everybody to, read anything from the vendor to kind of see like what's their write-up about this, if they even wrote it up at all. A lot of vulnerabilities back in the day got fixed simply because they patched something for a feature and they included some of these issues quietly. And in fact, a lot of that happens still today. There's a lot of software vendors out there that patch things silently, do not tell you about it. There's even stuff Microsoft will patch silently and then months later say, by the way, there was a vulnerability we patched three Patch Tuesdays ago. Because they're trying to protect that information against somebody opportunistically attacking it. So patch first, report later. Which, hey, there's good strategies around that. But a lot of people don't like to talk about how their baby's ugly. But there's also all these security organizations out there. We used to be the bad guys, the black hats, the hackers who would just go and break this software in our own free time, maybe liberate some resources in the meantime. But we would go through and then we would tell everybody about it on, BBS and IRC and forums and different places. Okay, everybody's about the same. A couple people aren't old enough to know that, but everybody in the room is old enough to know those days. I don't know the BBS days, but IRC for sure. It still exists. IRC you can still work on. Slack, right? Slack's IRC. So, and Discord's the new TeamSpeak. When it came to all of this, vulnerabilities, now that's the track. So, when you're looking at all these things, basically threat researchers, we'll call them today, would go and just say, hey, there's a big issue here, and you can do this with it. And then somebody goes and tries to, fix it, release a fix. A lot of software back in the day, of course, came on disk. You can't patch that. You'd have to reissue disk. If it is small enough, like maybe kilobytes, you could host it over the internet and download things as a patch, but very hard to do. Nowadays, of course, we don't worry about any of that. But we didn't really have a common way, again, of really collectively saying, here's what our vulnerabilities are. Every vendor had its own method. And so CVSS was a need for that. In the meantime, while we've been looking at all of these things, what has been our response? Classically, the response was, well, patch all the things. If you patch all the things, the vulns can't be exploited. Well, this sounds easy. We're good now, right? But really what it's come into in the last 20 years is, can you keep up with the change requests, the QA testing, the application breaking, limited people hours, and even your DevOps, your sysadmins, even your InfoSec people. We all have limited hours we're able to even do anything. And that's regardless of whether you're a 1 million user environment or 100 user environment. Everybody has limited time, and it doesn't scale all the same. And endless reporting metrics, ever-aging vulns, and honestly useless reporting on vulnerabilities. HD Moore actually had some good comments about all these bullshit metrics that we keep sending to people about aged vulns and different things. It's just to make us look like, oh, we're keeping busy, and is right. And CVSS kind of came to save us with that and said, hey, we're actually going to come together and we're going to tell you now a common vulnerability score system that you can then use to determine, vendors, how bad this is. Okay? So, common vulnerability scoring system was developed by NIAX, which is the National Infrastructure Advisory Commission, I think, or Council. And in 2003 is when it was developed, launched in 2005 by FIRST, which is the Forum of Incident Response Security Teams, I think. And in 2005 is when CVSS 1 was released and launched. And now we had a common way to score vulnerability, to know that a 10 is bad, and a 1 you may not need to pay attention to. But it still could represent a risk. HD Moore actually just in the keynote made note that 2005 is about the time when scan and patch actually started to break down. So it's kind of funny when CVSS came in to save the day and kind of tell us, hey, here's a way in which we can now rank these vulnerabilities and score these vulnerabilities. Scanning and patching was already starting to break down, right? So we already got the problem became too bad by the time someone got a solution to it. That's kind of how it goes, doesn't it? And then in 2007, we realized, oh wow, this scoring system doesn't account for a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily account for different environments. It doesn't account for things that might change about the vulnerability. And so in CVSS 2.0, in 2007 was launched. In 3.0, it got a major upgrade. And I believe in 3.0 is when they really started breaking the CVSS score into 3 parts. Who knew there were 3 parts to a CVSS score? A couple people. Okay. And you're going to love the next slide where I describe how CVSS really works. 2015 is when CVSS 3.0 came out, or 3.1 came out in 2019, and just back in November 1st, 2023, CVSS 4.0 was released. And so again, they're just trying to get better at scoring. They're trying to get better at scoring. But it's interesting at where they're trying to get better at scoring. It's not on the vendor side, really. Because how does CVSS work? Well, CVSS works by saying a base score. And this is the score you're going to see in every single one of your vulnerability management platforms. Every time you run a scanner, it comes back and says, here's a CVSS, 10. That's the score you're getting. You're getting the base score. Not the full score. You're just getting the base score. So this is a score that the owner, the vendor gives. And sometimes you'll find out where the National Vulnerability Database or MITRE goes and even adds their own score to it and say, you know what, you think it's a 9.8, we think it's a 10, or we think it's actually a 9.2 or an 8.6 or whatever. They'll make their own adjustment. But you'll have different opinions scores in there. It encompasses things such as access vector. How does this thing even come to be exploited? What's the access complexity, right? What's the authentication level? Is no authentication even needed? Do I just throw the magic packet at it and it gives me what I want, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability, right? So a DOS attack isn't going to necessarily be a major risk to your confidentiality of your system. Oh no, your system went down. Your stuff is even more secret now. So that may not be a vulnerability you may care about if the confidentiality score is 0, but the availability score is 10. But if you have a web front end for like an e-commerce, you may care very much about that, availability if it's a 10. You may not care so much about the confidentiality score. So it allows you to kind of start customizing vulnerabilities as the vector and as the different parts of that triad. User interaction. Hey, does this thing even need me to click something? Is something going to pop up? Does it require me to even click a link or do anything to get this? A lot of the Outlook vulnerabilities that we've seen recently are just, I looked at my email and now I just got owned, right? So very little user interaction in that case. Privileges required. Does it require no privileges? Again, does it require some kind of the user that clicks on it to have admin privileges? And then scope, and is this even a physical issue itself? Now that's all cool and seems like it has a lot, but that really just describes the issue for the piece of software or the system that you're talking about, right? Word, Excel, Adobe, Chrome, whatever that is. They're just thinking about that context. They're not thinking about your context in your environment. They're not thinking about where that is positioned in your network. They're not thinking about what else is exposed to that if that gets owned. That's where the temporal and environmental score comes in. And guess who gets to do those? You! Did you know that you need to score vulnerabilities yourself? Supposed to. Ain't got time for that, and I'm going to tell you why. Because the temporal score. So this is kind of interesting. Exploitability. Does this thing even have a working exploit for it? So sometimes, someone says, this is the worst thing ever, never gets an exploit for it. A lot of vulnerabilities that we kind of ignored. Oh, wow, in 30 days now has an exploit for it. It now has malware for it, and people are getting popped left, right, and center. So the exploitability is important to track there. Remediation level. That's not in CVSS 4 anymore, actually. Report confidence, also not in CVSS 4 anymore. Report confidence to me is kind of interesting. Pretty much any vulnerability reported by Google Chrome has a very low confidence rating with me, because they give no details. They give no details on this whatsoever. And so, whereas the Cisco vulnerability that was even talked about in the keynote just a bit ago, Cisco, they rolled out a fix, but they also said, here's the problem, here's the IOCs we're seeing out there, here's how you know where you got an issue. That was a really high confident report there. But anytime Google Chrome releases a vulnerability, I have no idea if it matters to my organization or not. Someone's browsing the internet. Are they even going to use the component that's vulnerable? Have no idea, because they're not going to tell me what the problem is. Oh, but it's a 10 and you need to fix it right now. Luckily, Chrome does have auto update, and that usually covers a lot of sins. So, but you also have your environmental score, and this is where that comes down to your environment yourself, right? So your organization, you have the collateral damage potential, target distribution, the impact subscore modifier. Okay, so that sounds like a bunch of D&D, right? The impact subscore modifier, like, oh yes, my bard would like to sing and seduce the dragon, roll for charisma, But that's not what that means. It basically says, what's the security requirements of the system that's vulnerable, right? Do I care? Is this a confidentiality based system? Is this system have a really quick turnaround time for recovery time object? Things like that is where that goes into. But collateral damage, if this gets hit, how much else is exposed to that, right? Is it segmented out? And target distribution, is it just one weird system we have out there that this is impacting, or is it everywhere? Is it ubiquitous, right? Zero logon was a huge issue. Print nightmare was a huge issue, because it's every single Windows computer pretty much by default configuration and by necessity. But again, CVSS, they do this for you. You've got to do this. And I will tell you, I have never scored my own vulnerabilities, because I do not have time to do that. And neither do you. So what did we do? CVSS came along and we're like, hey, well, you know what? Let's not patch all the things. Let's just patch the CVSS 9 through 10. All right, and that's going to save us. After all, those are the criticals. That's the one that the vendor said was the most problematic and the big issues. And surely the attackers are going to see that and go, oh, look, this is new, cannon fodder for me. I'm just going to go and take care of these guys. They've got CVSS 9 through 10s on them. Vendor's telling me it's critical. But again, did you do that temporal environmental scoring when you saw that? No, probably not. However, each time I look at a 0-day that comes out, I pretty much do a lot of the temporal scoring. I just don't do it as a part of CVSS. I just look and see, do these tick enough boxes in the right places that I go, yeah, we're going to fix this right now, right? So the problem really at the end of the day is CVSS never changes. And this is actually a bit of an eye chart, and I apologize for that. And it looks like the screen breaks up at just the right parts. So you're not going to miss any data. But this is a bit of an eye chart here, and I apologize. This does come from a special fancy tool you can buy that I do have, that I use, and I dump the data from it in order to get it. But you don't need fancy tools for this. But here's the cool information. As a matter of totality, I think the total number of vulnerabilities, I'm actually going to go back to another part of so pretty much all the vulnerabilities that we know about today that have CVEs associated, we're over 300,000 now. It's a lot. We're dealing with a lot of vulnerabilities. And you can see the CVSS scores over across the top. Your criticals high, medium, low. We've got 34,000 criticals, 84,000 highs, 100,000 mediums, 81,000 lows. But here's the interesting thing. Let's start looking at what is even exploitable, or rather known exploitable out there. Technically, a vulnerability is exploitable almost by definition because somebody exploited it to figure out it's vulnerable. Okay? Well, let's just understand. It is exploitable. but most people aren't going to probably know what the exploit is today. So we're going to talk about exploits that, because by virtue of it being a 0 day, so we know a threat actor has used it. We know a threat actor has used it, even though it may not be a 0 day. It's a published a published exploit, a proof of concepts out there, right? So known exploitables, of the 34,000 criticals that are out there today, only 6,400 of them are even exploitable. However, 19,000 highs and 16,000 mediums are exploitable. Oh wow, now we're underwater on our priority, aren't we? If we're focusing on the criticals, we just missed a whole shit ton of exploitable things potentially in our environment. Of course, hopefully your environment doesn't have every vulnerability known to man. And you even have an informational that's exploitable, known exploitable. What? I think it was a DNS NX transfer issue. So yeah, that's exploitable. Remote code execution, privilege escalation. Okay, so how many of those things are going to give me shell or give me elevated shell, right? Well, that's only 2,500 criticals. Of the highs, you have 5,000, and of the mediums, you have 3,900. Okay, we're still underwater with our mediums and lows compared to our criticals. We're focusing on the wrong thing. Now, let's take that one step further and say, now, which of those have been trending in the last 30 days as of March 23rd, 2024, when I gather this data for another talk? 47 criticals. Now we're back on top. And we've got 17 highs and 6 mediums. So if you were to ask me, of all the vulnerabilities you want to pay attention to in your environment, there's probably 75 vulnerabilities that I would say go get right now and take and see if they're in your environment today. Right now. Now, next week, that's going to change. And it probably has changed in the last 2 weeks since I've given this talk, right? So that's there. The big thing that I think is an interesting data point was back in 2020 where Carnegie Mellon released some research that basically said 4% of CVEs get an exploit within 365 days of publish, and most of them aren't the criticals. Another thing to think about is that attackers aren't scanning your environment and saying, oh, that's a CVSS 10. I'm going to target that. What are they looking for? Hey, that's going to give me a shell. And it takes me very little skills to land. Ooh, there is exploit DB code on this. Copy paste. There's a Metasploit module for this. Thank you. Hey, let's go ahead and just use that. There's a lot of things that attackers are doing there that figure nothing into the way we actually assess vulnerabilities and have assessed vulnerabilities for the past 15 years. We've been assessing vulnerabilities in a very compliance-based way. Compliance is very much fueled, as HD spoke about in the keynote, compliance is very much fueled how we do vulnerability management by just saying, yep, you've categorized them, you need to remediate them, every single one of them. We're going to kind of put a stop to that here. There is a better way. So I have basically 3 questions that I ask myself when I'm thinking about prioritization mechanisms and schemes. Is a vulnerability without an exploit even a threat to my organization today? I would say the threat's probably not 0, but it's definitely not 100, at 100 out of 100. And it's probably not even 50. It's probably not even 25. It's maybe not even 2 digits. It's very low. Is a vuln that doesn't give the attacker remote code execution or privilege escalation as big a threat as ones that do? That was kind of a weird double negative, but hey, if they're not going to get a shell from this, is it as big of a deal? Now, you may have systems that you care about memory side channel attacks. You may have systems where you care about DDoS more so than remote code execution. So figure that into it. But as a general ubiquitous threat to your organization, RCEP probably matters a whole hell of a lot more than most things right now to get started. And are the vulns under recent exploit development or attacker usage more of a threat to you than other vulnerabilities that aren't? So that's pretty much how I've redefined prioritization for me. So pretty much if it's critical to me, I need to fix that in 14 days, but that's only because it's exploitable. It's going to give somebody shell or or privilege escalation, and it has some kind of recency about it in the last 30 days. Okay, so this tells me attack is imminent. And if it's really imminent, especially if it's public facing like Ivanti or Cisco AnyConnect or something like that, then that's probably something that may rise to the level of emergency. These are great candidate vulnerabilities for everybody. Stop what you're doing. We're going to enumerate, we're going to mitigate, and we're going to upgrade these systems or do whatever changes we need to make sure this does not exist in our environment anymore. But critical, 14 days. We should be able to get this in a sprint cycle. High, exploitable, right? So, and we've got remote code execution. And mediums are, just exploitable. Fix them in 90 days. From the high perspective, fix within 30 days. And I tend to not really pay attention to vulnerability management until at least the team has had an opportunity to patch, especially on OS vulnerabilities. Software vulnerabilities may be a little different, but OS vulnerabilities should be in regular patch cadence anyway. That's going to give me an idea of if they're following patch cadence and if we miss something. So I'm going to give them 30 days. If it's a high vulnerability there, let's just say Microsoft had a patch Tuesday without a critical. One of these days they'll maybe have that. But let's just say that we found a high vulnerability there according to this scheme and nothing critical. Okay, fine. We're going to give you the next 30 days. You need to catch up, but you're on notice now and you're being tracked. If you're in a very highly qualified environment, you may have deviations and other things to file if they don't get that done. Now, once you've got a system like this in place, now you're either managing the data set yourself or you have a fancy tool to do it yourself, to do it as well. But you can also start adding other dimensions to this. So you can start saying, is this public facing? Does the system house confidential data? How good's your CMDB out there, right? Does your CMDB have some kind of mechanism to say this has a recovery time object of 8 hours or a day, a week? Depending on where your risk appetite is, you may basically kind of say like, well, this is at a 5 and this is at a 1, 1 being the most and 5 being the least, right? And you might say from a risk perspective, yes, this is a highly risky system. We care about it very much. Let's treat it like our pet and everything. Well, guess what? That may end up just moving all the vulnerabilities up by one mark. Maybe this system has so little risk to us, or maybe even the mitigations are such that we don't even care so much about a system like this. We're good. It's maybe air-gapped. It may be an OT environment. We may have to actually move these down if you've got those mitigations in place. And we may also use those to rank these down. So now your criticals are highs. You have longer to fix them. You may even get to a situation, especially in OT environments, where you have separate schemes. A critical may not even be able to be patched for like 3 months. A high or a medium, maybe 6 months, maybe maybe a year, because systems can't go down. Systems can't be interrupted. And they don't have the type of high availability in OT environment is far, far more expensive to put in than just putting another VM into the cluster. So that's a lot more expensive. It plays into that risk mitigation equation. But these factors could elevate or even deprioritize a particular vulnerability on a particular system for what you prioritize. And something that HD actually brought up as well is don't necessarily pay attention to just the vulnerabilities themselves. Track technology. Is it really matter that CVE 2020, 75251, I don't even know if that's a real CVE, is vulnerable here, or does it really just matter that you have, Adobe that's 10 years out of date? Some vulnerability scanners, and even things like Tanium that try to be vulnerability scanners, they will say different things. They'll sometimes list their findings out as individual CVEs, so you'll have 100 CVEs for something, and some vulnerability scanners will just say, you have an out-of-date this, and here's the highest vulnerability for it, or here's the number of CVEs associated. I like those consolidated findings better, because at the end of the day, that hints at the fix. The fix is get your shit up to date. That's one fix to fix, 100 vulnerabilities. I have 100 problems, but I got one solution. And that's a lot more manageable. And that also looks better in a ticket too. If you try to send a ticket to somebody, I got one problem for you to solve. Just go patch this and this gets fixed. And it's 100 different things. But some vuln scanners don't do that. Some vuln scanners pop out and say, here's all the CVEs. And now you're like, oh yeah, this system has 5,000 CVEs, but really it's just for 3 products. So you have to go and kind of add that context. So you might also evaluate your scanner or your different data inputs and kind of think about how you consolidate that down so that, and then if you're consolidating multiple data sources, you may have something like Qualys and something like Microsoft, which will do the opposite. One does one does the other. So you might have, 101 issues when you really just have one issue because it all refers to the same technology that's out of date or that has an issue. So this is now a visual of the recasting. So there's that eye chart that I talked about before, but now here's, if you want to look at what we should worry about, really all the vulnerabilities that aren't exploitable even, there's only 265,000 of them. And again, they are exploitable at some point. And if somebody cares a lot enough about it, they are going to find a way to exploit it. It's exploitable because it's vulnerable. It's a known vulnerability out there, so it can be exploited. But someone's going to have to do extra work. That's less opportunity, right, that's out there. Because criminals are on a time too. Criminals are on timetables. And don't fool yourself into thinking you're going to stop nation state like Russia, the United States, China, Israel from getting into your organizations. They will. They will get into your organizations. And they'll use the lows if they have to. If they really want to burn a 0-day, if they really want to burn an exploit that's not out there yet, they will. But we've got all these opportunities that they already have access to, like 42,000 of them. So maybe we should start focusing on those instead and recategorizing our vulnerabilities. So how do we get started without fancy tooling? Well, so you can use Excel. Everything comes back to Excel at some point. You can also use Power BI. I think HD was talking about even using things like Elk Stack and Kibana and different things. You could probably also use like Microsoft has their log analytics platform, so you could probably also feed data into that and correlate off of that. But whatever tickles your fancy, really. But really, we're talking about some really simple data. We're not talking about large databases and multidimensionality here. We're literally just talking about columns on a single table here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those vulnerabilities. So we've got an asset IP, we've maybe got a host name, we've got information about the host. Great, fantastic. We've got the vulnerability issue. It could be the CVE itself. It could also simply be the title that it's out of date. Okay, fine. We may have some vulnerability scoring from CVSS. Okay, fine. So that's a vulnerability. That's already a low by default. How do we know if it's exploitable? Well, we do luckily have things like the Metasploit framework. We do have things like ExploitDB. We do have the CISA KEV. And so what we can do is we can add columns here to say, is this present in one of those things? If it's present in one of those things, we know it's exploitable. It's known exploitable out there. There is a known exploit for it out there. So we already know these are going to be mediums. So that already checks the logic there. Okay, fine. Now, when were they added to that, right? So now you're going to get your recency, which comes a little later. But what we can also take a look at is, searching through ExploitDB, Metasploit framework, and you can even search through KEV. They provide details about what this vulnerability does. Look for things like remote code execution. If you're interested in denial of service, look for things that have denial of service and map those to the particular assets you care about. Again, you can add more columns for the CIA triad. Which one do we care about more on this system? And so you can go through that and start categorizing those vulnerabilities that way. Let's just say RCEP. If you see any of those on a vulnerability, now you tick a box there. Now you've got your highs figured out. Okay, now you need that recency. How recent was it put into one of those databases or updated? Now you're going to miss a lot because you're not on the dark web looking for, where people are talking about this vulnerability. You're not on Twitter watching Will Dorman's Twitter feed to see when he's finally got a proof of concept for something out there. So some of that you're just going to have to probably keep up by hand. But for stuff that is more known already or that's kind of getting automated into these feeds, and you can use things like ISACs. If you have any ISACs that are keeping up with this, you could probably keep up with it there. You might have a feed you can work on. It works in a lot of different ways. That's a low-cost proof-of-concept way to get started. And you can automate that and constantly check it and have your dashboard in Power BI, or you can also do it up in Log Analytics in Azure or any place you want to. You could put it into your SIM if you want. Kind of expensive to store those, but hey, it's at least it's not firewall logs, right? So you're gonna get the data you need, and you're gonna get the insights you need. And also integrate it with your CMDB info, right? Risk scores. So you can also put in the risk score here. Is this a high risk asset, a low risk asset? And again, that can help you rescore and redetermine where you think this matters in priority. You can add another column that says, is this an internet facing system? Is it behind a load balancer? Does it have certain mitigations in place? Again, kind of the world's your oyster in that way. You just add more columns and you do more logic. And I'm sure there's better ways to do it, but that is one way you could do it. You could also buy a fancy tool. But when you buy a fancy tool, you don't get near the customization you would like to build, right? So other considerations. You're probably going to have to convince auditors that this is okay. Because they're going to say, well, your last vulnerability report showed that you have 500 CVSS criticals. When were those resolved? You're going to have to tell them we do not ever plan on resolving those. What do you mean you don't ever plan on resolving those? Unless it's a PCI, I suppose. What do you mean you don't plan on remediating those? Those are critical vulnerabilities. According to our matrix, we don't think they're critical. Here's our plan. Here's how we rank things. We do not use CVSS as a criticality. We pay attention to the threat to our organization. Here's what's a threat to our organization, and here's how we came up with that. Here's our plan to remediate. And here's where we're showing where we're remediating those things. And here's where it is in our policy. So now what you just did is you took that auditor who just takes kind of something from the CISSP handbook or something, and now you've got a policy, you've got a procedure. Already you're halfway to convincing them the fact you've got a policy and a procedure. And you're following it, you're 75% of the way. And also you're taking a risk-based, a threat-based approach and scoring these now yourself, reorganizing these. That's going to go a long way to help convince an auditor that this is an okay way to do things. You are following your process. It's regulated by your own team, and you've got things under control. Not to mention, when you start fixing those criticals according to this scheme, a lot of those cascade issues back. So you fix a critical, how many lows did you just fix? So those do get closed. We're also not going to care much about age of vulnerabilities. So those bullshit reports about, what's the age of vulnerabilities out there? We don't care. We don't care how long the vulnerability has been known. We don't care how long the vulnerability has been in our system. I just care, is it executable and exploitable in my environment? Is it going to give the attacker something that I care that they don't have? And is it something that's been recent? Fix it now, or fix it very quickly. CVEs aren't the only vulnerabilities, right? So these are only basically now software bugs. These aren't misconfigurations in your environment, right? Local admin is still a vulnerability. Everybody having local admin is a vulnerability. Having your Kerberos misconfigured so that Kerberosting is a thing is a vulnerability in your environment. Allowing calc.exe to open PowerShell is a vulnerability. You probably shouldn't allow those things. So there's a lot of hardening things you should go through. A lot of vulnerability scanners will take something like the CIS hardening guides. You can also run your own checklists, and you can check for where you're out of hardening. So you're defining your own weaknesses in a way. So you can add that to this mix too, and you can add criticality to those based on how you think those rank. There's also people now getting into Active Directory level vulnerabilities. How we've categorized or how we've opened ourselves to attack based on recursive group, a computer being a domain or enterprise admin, God forbid. So all these things exist. Let's also not forget, this is Jeff Mann's risk equation now, not the standard risk equation that we're used to. But risk equals vulns plus threats minus countermeasures, what Jeff Mann likes to call security. Okay, so consider this for a second. If I want to reduce my risk, the threats, they don't really change. The threats are out there. They just get different tricks, all right? So the threats are out there. The same bad guys are trying to make money off of us, steal our property, stop us from operating. But our vulnerabilities do change. So we can either reduce our vulnerability to reduce our risk, or we can increase our countermeasures, right? And so there's going to be times where you're not going to be able to patch vulnerabilities. You're not going to be able to configure them away. You're going to have to increase the countermeasures to reduce that risk. And again, this whole thing that we're trying to do here is attacking more of that vulnerability side. But don't forget countermeasures. What countermeasures do you have that could help you deprioritize that vulnerability, buy you more time to figure out what you need to do with that? So, key takeaways here. CVSS is no longer appropriate. Actually, it was never appropriate. And if you follow First even said it is not a prioritization guideline. Essentially, the base score is not a prioritization framework. But that's what we've used it as for the past 15 years. But CVSS is no longer appropriate for prioritizing or communicating a severity of a vulnerability. You need to take a threat-based approach, examining exploitability, what type of exploit, recency, your own environment factors, and you need to categorize that way. You don't need a fancy scoring system to necessarily do a lot of math, a lot of algorithmic work to figure out what score this is to make me care about something. We can just use categories, and we can categorize the hell out of something. You can also roll your own prioritization automation, or you can get a commercial tool. 3 of the commercial tools I know that exist right now: Kenna, Ivanti RiskSense, also known as Neurons for Threat and Vulnerability Management. They have Neurons for everything. It's dumb. That's the one I have. And then you also have NopSec. And there's many, many more out there. And even some of the places like Tenable and Qualys and Rapid7, they're trying to build their own into their platforms today too. But they still don't have a lot of those integrations that pull everything together. They want you to use their tool. So try to go as platform agnostic as possible. Not only this, but I think your IT ops are going to love you a little more because you're not sending them hundreds of criticals. You're now sending them maybe 5 to deal with. And your patching cadence, but also your remediation cadence might matter. You're probably not going to do this and prioritize on a daily basis. You're probably not going to prioritize on a weekly basis. To start, you're probably going to prioritize. Maybe you need to prioritize on a quarterly basis just to see how that works. But you may need to prioritize on a monthly basis to just get started out there. Because in your environment, you probably have things that haven't been patched for 5 years. And you're going to finally get them patched. Because now you have something to show that says, yes, this is an issue we need to care about right now. More so than just CVSS. Oh yeah, it's the same boring thing. We don't have time. Well, now you do, because it's just one thing I'm asking you to do. Questions? Or comments, observations, criticisms?
What are your thoughts on the exploit prediction, EPSS?
So I actually forgot to put a slide in for that. I've been trying to understand EPSS more. So exploit prediction scoring system, also from First, the makers of not the makers, the maintainers of CVSS, but the ones who roll out the new models, right? They've also come together and created EPSS, exploit prediction scoring system. What they're basically doing is taking vulnerabilities regardless of their CVSS, and they're saying which ones have the characteristics that are, by the data, by our past understanding of vulnerabilities, are most likely to receive an exploit in the next however long, 30 days, 2 weeks, a month, a year. And so it gives it a score. The closer to 1, the more imminent danger there is. The closer to 0, this thing's never going to get an exploit associated with it, right? Again, somebody knows how to exploit this somewhere. But do the bad guys know how to exploit this yet? And so that's what it's trying to do. Now, there's some really good data science behind it. And there are some really good, interesting predictors. And you know what? If you just want an easy button that may work for you, especially to start and reduce a lot of your work, you actually may consider looking at EPSS. There's a lot of vendor buy-in around it right now. Different vendors are coming in and overlaying their CVSS scores with EPSS scores and saying, here's the EPSS score on that. And you might say, yes, let's go after EPSS score, 9.8 or something. You may have to figure out and tune for yourself what you do there. The only thing I guess I don't like about it is I like to define my threat model myself a little more and determine what really matters to me and go from there. EPSS might actually be one of those vectors that you put in here as an extra thing to determine whether you want to go high, medium, low, or critical. So that may be something you want to do. It may be a great opportunity for that new patch Tuesday. Is there anything in there that has an EPSS score of this? Let's break patch cycles and let's go ahead and fix it now because it's going to be imminent. So it may be nice and supplementary to this kind of a program. I'm not saying EPSS is bad. I think it's a good resource. I think everybody should look into it, and it may work for you, and you may find it's really easy to work with, and you don't have to do a lot of data handling like this. However, I think that when you look at issues like this way, you're probably going to do a lot more inventory management and attack surface management this way. And I think that gets you more knowledge about your environment and gets you to make better decisions about your environment, just rather than just focusing on a number. But, you know, again, to just take care of the end goal, it could probably work.
So one thing you mentioned that was something that I found particularly valuable as well is boiling things down and grouping them by the actual fix, like the resolution of it, you know, rather than sending out, you've got 250 vulnerabilities on
right.
the system. You have, please apply standard patches this month.
Yeah.
Are you aware of a good open or public resource that does that sort of mapping, or is that just going to be secret sauce common?
It's all secret sauce. If you find a tool that's able to do all that, you will beat IBM, Microsoft, and everybody else at their own game. Big Fix was supposed to take care of all this for us, and it didn't. It became just too terrible. SCCM was supposed to take care of all this for us, and it didn't. Ivanti Patch Management is supposed to take care of all this for us, and it doesn't. There's blind spots. There's going to be a lot of issues there. I don't know of an open data source you can gather. You're going to have to go into Microsoft's vulnerability database and say, what are the latest patches that need to be run for this? Not only that, but sometimes when you go to patches, it isn't enough. You've also got to make a special registry key change, or you got to make sure a configuration change is involved. Some vulnerabilities even require, like there's some PHP vulnerabilities that require Nginx to be configured in a certain way to even be exploitable to begin with. So that's another thing to even think about. This doesn't even account for the vulnerability understanding itself of, hey, is the thing that's vulnerable even exposed in this way because we don't have something else? A lot of times they're just going by the version number to say that this is a weakness that exists, maybe for your environment. So again, you might still have to do your research, but now you're limiting the scope of what you go down and research quicker. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't know of a single solution to help you on that one. Cool.
On the topic of misconfiguration.
Yeah.
Maybe some that have ended up having exploitability to it.
Mm-hmm.
So an example, Active Directory has DNS and the certificate templates like the certified pre-owned.
Yep.
Like I would consider that a vulnerability because you leave that all authenticated users as the default permission.
Yeah.
Anybody can get a privilege.
Insecure by default, right? Yeah, so there's so many defaults that come. I mean, it's the same as admin as your username and password for the thing that you just unboxed. A lot of times Active Directory and the certificate services, when you open them up and you start them, there's work to do to just get it set up to where you're not going to shoot yourself in the gut. That's one of those things. So absolutely, CVEs are not the only vulnerabilities that are out there. Misconfigurations are huge, and Bloodhound and a lot of other scanners out there could generate more data for you to kind of determine where those weaknesses are in those environments. And that is a free tool. Well, they also have an enterprise version, but it's a free tool. If you can amass the Neo4j database size, your environment may be prohibitively large to handle the Neo4j database size. The correlations are infinitely scaling. Yeah, that ThinkCastle. Anything else? Observations or comments or criticisms or questions?
Really thorough.
What?
Very thorough.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm available for more questions or one-on-one interactions. And of course, you can find me on the socials listed there. Thank you very much for your kind attention.